Look, on the face of it, Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers inherit a very strong Australian economy. The unemployment rate, 3.9%, is the lowest in almost 50 years. There's also strong economic growth. But there are challenges that are coming. There's rising inflation, rising interest rates, the prospect of a global recession. So how would an Albanese government cope with these things? What things might they in the future need to cut? Well, let's bring in here the Chief Economist of HSBC Australia, Paul Bloxham, who joins me now. Paul, many thanks for your time.
Hi, Ross.
I want to go there to the government and the economy that it inherits. Just tell me what sort of an economy Australia has got right now. I gave some of the headlines, but underlying all of that, what's it like right now to manage Australia's economy?
Oh, look, I think the Australian economy has got a fair bit of positive momentum in terms of the growth story. We have learnt to live with the COVID-19 virus probably better than we even expected. And the economy's got this pretty decent momentum. You're seeing it reflected, as you say, in quite a lot of job creation. The unemployment rate's at its lowest level since 1974. And so in general, it's an economy that's quite positive. But as you also relay, and I agree, there are lots of challenges on the horizon. One of the challenges is, of course, that we've got global inflation that's picking up, and it is flowing over to Australia as well. And as a result, the RBA felt the need to lift interest rates just a couple of weeks ago and give clear guidance that there are rate rises coming. So interest rates have got to go up to try and slow the economy down and take some of the inflationary pressure out of the story. And then, of course, I guess that relays through to what the government needs to think about in terms of its fiscal stance. Because if the RBA is in the business now of tightening up monetary policy to try and slow things down a bit, to take a bit of pressure out of the economy and keep inflation contained, well, the government needs to start thinking about how they are going to consolidate the fiscal position as well. If we do a lot of fiscal spending at the same time, that may very well just put more upward pressure on inflation, force interest rates to go higher. It's a tricky environment. Neither party was talking about it prior to the election. Of course, now we've got a Labor government that's going to have to deal with that challenge of balancing, finding the right mix for fiscal policy that achieves the objectives that it has in mind, but at the same time, not pump priming the economy too much, because we've already got an economy that's kind of operating at capacity where the RBA is having to lift interest rates. It's a tricky environment, and that's not even to mention, of course, the global risks that we've got to watch playing out as well.
Okay, I was going to go to that point because given the fact that the primary vote of both of the parties, both the Labor Party and the Coalition fell in this election, I just get this notion that maybe no political party in Australia is right now prepared to take the very hard decisions. And to me, at least, I was critical of both sides of politics coming into this election campaign for willingly wanting to spend and grow the economy faster in the face of this rising inflation and the prospect of ever higher interest rates. That to me leads to a fiscal cliff at some point if you don't draw back from that. I'm just wondering whether there's enough discipline inside the new government to actually avert that fiscal cliff.
This would have been a challenge, as you say, for both parties, no matter who was running the country. And I do agree with this story. I mean, just to put a few facts around that story, the last budget that was put together in late March showed that Australia, the projections suggest that we are going to have a structural budget deficit all the way out over the horizon to at least 2032. That's 10 years from now. We've still got a structural budget deficit. And to break that down for people who are watching, that means the government is currently committed to too much spending, that it hasn't got enough tax revenue to deliver. It's going to run deficits unless there are policy measures taken that adjust the amount of spending they're going to make and reduce it, or find more tax revenue from somewhere. And I think neither of those things were a part of the national discussion in the lead up to the election. But of course, that is primarily a big concern, that something that the Labor Party needs to look at, of course, in government. It's going to be a big challenge. It's going to be one of those challenges that we face, that we're running structural budget deficits, and we need to find a way to at least at some point start to head that budget back towards balance, honouring all the commitments, of course, that have already been put forward, and all of the challenges we face in terms of social policy as well.
But isn't the fundamental problem here, Paul, that, far from trying to actually just simply get back to a balanced budget, that the real problem is that if there is the chance of a global recession, and the risk of it seems to be rising by the week in Europe and in the United States, that will certainly hit Australia and hit our incomes, and therefore the government will be forced to cut simply because it will not have the income coming through the door. And the worst scenario would be is if it led to rising unemployment here in Australia.
Well, I think there's another way to frame it as well. If we do have another global downturn, and as you say, I do look offshore and think the risks are certainly building. If you look at all the various things that are going on, the geopolitical risks, the COVID zero strategy in China, and of course, rising interest rates globally as a result of high inflation, all of these things are adding up to tangible downside risks to the global story. If that were to happen, the likely advice that either side of government would get from the Treasury is that actually fiscal policy needs to be more supportive. And of course, we start off in this budget deficit position with higher debt levels and so on. It's a much trickier policy environment right now than we faced for a while, I think. And primarily that comes from the fact that inflation is already elevated. If you've got inflation that's higher and you start off with higher inflation, it gives you fewer policy options. You can't just all out pull the levers without potentially exacerbating that inflation challenge. And so I think it's quite a tricky thing to work through. But I think one of the things we really need to have a hard look at is what's happening in terms of those fiscal settings. Because, as I say, the RBA has already judged that inflation is now high enough that they're going to have to lift interest rates sequentially. Interest rates are going to go up. That's going to slow the economy. We need to look at the fiscal side and how it can best manage this complicated scenario that we're working through.
Yeah, because we already know that Labor was going to spend some $8.4 billion more than the Coalition over the next 4 years. So that's extra spending that arguably is adding to the inflationary story, which is arguably adding to the story of higher interest rates. Because if government does not at least ease back that spending, then the reality is that the Reserve Bank might have to put interest rates higher than it otherwise might have.
That's certainly true, although I'd highlight that I think both parties were out there doing a fair bit of spending and neither were really talking about the idea of needing to deliver fiscal consolidation anytime soon. So it is something we didn't face really a choice in this election. And maybe, as you say, that may have impacted how the vote ended up playing out more towards the non-majors. But we didn't. Both parties were talking about the idea of still running quite a large amount of fiscal support for the economy at a time when, of course, we've already got interest rates rising. We've already got those inflationary pressures. It is a tricky environment to manage. And of course, I guess the other thing is there have been commitments, as you relay, made through the campaign to deliver certain things. But there's a lot of things missing from the list of things that we really need. And that's a lot of what I've been writing about, that neither party has been talking about tax reform or competition policy reform. Clearly, the climate and energy agenda is something that's actually shifted the way that the population's voted. And so climate policy is something that needs to really be primarily in focus as well. And a lot of these bigger picture items just weren't part of the election discussion in the way that they ought to have been. And then the question becomes, does the government then have a mandate to deliver on any of those things? And potentially, it might be some time before we actually look at some sort of reform agenda that actually gets the productivity growth to lift and the economy to grow more solidly in a medium-term sense.
I'll tell you, it's going to be fascinating, but of course that also will depend on the composition of our parliament as well. So time will tell whether it's a reform government, whether it's forced to be a reform government, or indeed it's forced to cut back at some point in the future. The Chief Executive of HSBC here in Australia, Paul Bloxham, many thanks for your time on the program today.